What if I told you the more you talk, the less people actually listen, and the people who say the least often hold the most power in the room? We live in a world that rewards noise. Everyone is trying to speak louder, explain more, prove themselves constantly. But somewhere in that chaos, something important gets lost. Presence, control, respect. This audiobook isn't about becoming silent. It's about understanding when not to speak and why that changes everything. Because when you learn to say less, your words begin to carry weight. And when your words carry weight, people start to listen differently. So before we talk about power, we need to understand the trap most people are already stuck in. A world where everyone is talking, but almost no one is being heard.
Chapter 1. The Loud World Trap. It's strange if you really stop and notice it. Everywhere you go, someone is talking. Not just talking, explaining, reacting, posting, defending, proving. A constant stream of words spilling out as if silence itself has become something to avoid. Open any app, walk into any room, sit in any group, and there it is. Noise. Endless layered overlapping noise. At first, it feels normal, expected even. You might think, this is just how people are now. But if you look a little closer, something doesn't quite add up. Because despite all this talking, very few people are actually being heard. Think about the last time someone spoke and the entire room went quiet. Not out of politeness, but because their words carried weight. There was something different about them. No rushing, no over-explaining, just a calm, deliberate presence. And when they spoke, people listened. Why? It's tempting to say they were just more confident, or more intelligent, or maybe they had higher status. That could be part of it, but it doesn't fully explain what's happening. There's something subtler at play, something most people overlook. The less someone speaks, the more attention their words seem to command. Now compare that to the opposite. Someone who talks constantly, explains everything, fills every silence, adds more detail than necessary just in case they're misunderstood. At first, it might come across as enthusiasm, openness, maybe even friendliness. But over time, something shifts. Their words begin to lose sharpness. Their presence starts to feel lighter, easier to ignore. People nod, but they don't really absorb what's being said. The impact fades. Not because the person lacks value, but because they've unintentionally diluted it. There's a quiet rule most people never learn. The more available your words are, the less valuable they appear. It's not always fair, but it's consistent. And once you start noticing it, you see it everywhere. In meetings, the person who speaks first, longest, and most often isn't always the one who influences the decision. It's often the one who waits, who listens, who speaks only when they have something precise to add. In conversations, the person who explains themselves repeatedly can start to seem unsure, even if they're right. Meanwhile, the one who speaks simply, then stops, often appears more certain. Even in social situations, the dynamic holds. The loudest person might get attention, but not always respect. And attention without respect doesn't last. So why do we fall into this trap? Why do we keep talking even when it works against us? Part of it is subtle conditioning. From a young age, many of us are taught, directly or indirectly, that speaking up is how you prove your worth. You answer quickly, you explain clearly, you show what you know. Silence, on the other hand, can feel like hesitation, or worse, invisibility. So we learn to fill space, to respond instantly, to avoid pauses, to make sure nothing is left unsaid. Because somewhere along the way, it started to feel like saying less meant being less. But there's another layer to it, one that runs deeper. Talking gives a sense of control. When you explain yourself, you feel like you're shaping how others see you. When you keep speaking, you avoid the uncertainty of what others might think in the silence. Silence, after all, leaves room. Room for interpretation, room for judgment, room for things you can't fully manage. And that can feel uncomfortable. So instead of sitting with that discomfort, most people rush to fill it. They talk and talk and talk. Here's where it gets interesting. The more you try to control perception through constant explanation, the less control you actually have. Because instead of appearing clear and composed, it can start to feel like you're seeking validation, or approval, or reassurance that you're being understood. And people pick up on that, even if they can't quite explain how. It shows in small ways. A slight shift in how seriously they take your words, a slight decrease in how closely they listen, a growing sense that your voice blends into the background. Not because what you're saying lacks meaning, but because it's being delivered too often, too freely, without restraint.
Imagine a song where every note is played at the same volume without pause. No rhythm, no silence, no contrast. At first, it might sound fine, but after a while, it becomes noise. The impact disappears. Now imagine the opposite, a piece of music where silence is used deliberately, where pauses create tension, where certain notes stand out because they're not surrounded by constant sound. That's what makes it powerful. Not just what's played, but what isn't. Human communication works in a similar way. When every thought is spoken, nothing stands out. When every moment is filled, nothing feels significant. But when words are chosen carefully, when silence is allowed to exist, something changes. People start to lean in, not because you're louder, but because you're not. There's also a psychological shift that happens, one you might not expect. When you speak less, you begin to observe more. You notice reactions, tone, subtle cues that usually get missed when you're focused on what to say next. You start to understand conversations instead of just participating in them. And that awareness, it quietly increases your influence, because now when you do speak, it's not just reactive, it's intentional. But let's be honest for a moment. This isn't easy, at least not at first. When you start pulling back, speaking less, pausing more, it can feel unnatural. You might worry that people will think you have nothing to say, or that you're disengaged, or worse, that you're being overlooked. That fear can be strong enough to pull you right back into old habits, filling space, explaining,
adding just a little more just to be safe. And yet, if you stay with that discomfort, something surprising begins to happen. People don't forget you. They notice you. Your presence doesn't shrink, it sharpens. Instead of blending into the noise, you stand slightly apart from it. Not in a dramatic way, just enough to be felt. There's a certain kind of strength in that. Not loud, not forceful, but steady. The kind of strength that doesn't need constant expression to be recognized. This doesn't mean silence is always the answer. Far from it. There are moments where speaking up matters deeply, where clarity is necessary, where your voice needs to be heard. But those moments become more powerful when they're not surrounded by constant noise. When your words are rare, they carry more weight. When your voice isn't always present, it becomes more noticeable when it is. Think of it like this. If someone talks all day, every day, their voice becomes part of the environment. But if someone speaks only when it matters, their voice becomes an event. Something people pay attention to, something they remember. And that's the shift this chapter begins to uncover. Not a complete transformation, not yet. Just a subtle awareness that maybe, just maybe, the instinct to say more isn't always serving you. That the pressure to constantly express, explain, and prove might be quietly working against your presence. Because in a world where everyone is trying to be heard, the person who chooses their words carefully stands out. Not by force, but by contrast. So the next time you find yourself about to add more, to explain again, to fill a pause, to make absolutely sure you're understood, pause for a second. Ask yourself, is this adding value or just adding noise? You don't need to answer out loud. In fact, that's kind of the point. Something is shifting. You can feel it, even if you can't fully name it yet. And this is only the beginning. Chapter 2. Why Silence Feels Uncomfortable. Have you ever noticed how quickly people rush to fill a pause? It happens almost instantly. A question is asked, answered, and then, before the silence even has time to settle, someone adds more, a clarification, a justification, a small extra detail that wasn't really necessary, but somehow feels important in the moment. It's subtle, almost automatic, and most of the time, no one questions it. But sit in that moment a little longer, just a second more than usual, and something starts to surface. A strange kind of tension. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough to make you aware of it. Silence, it turns out, isn't neutral. It carries weight. For many people, that weight feels uncomfortable. Not because something is wrong, but because something is uncertain. When no one is speaking, there's nothing to hold on to. No clear signal, no immediate feedback. You don't quite know what the other person is thinking or how they're interpreting what was just said. And the mind doesn't like that. It starts searching for resolution. Did I say the right thing? Do they agree? Should I explain that differently? Maybe I should add one more point just to be clear. So you speak again, not always because you have something new to say, but because the silence feels unfinished. This is where most people get pulled in without realizing it. They mistake silence for a problem, something that needs to be fixed. But what if it isn't? What if silence is doing exactly what it's supposed to do? Think about a conversation where someone asks you a question, and then, instead of jumping in right away, you pause, just for a moment. Maybe you're thinking, maybe you're choosing your words, maybe you're simply not rushing. That pause, small as it is, changes the dynamic. The other person becomes more attentive. They wait. There's a subtle shift in focus, as if the space between words has suddenly become part of the conversation itself. Now compare that to answering immediately without any pause at all. The words come out quickly, easily, and often, just as quickly, they pass by. There's less tension, less anticipation, less impact. It's a small difference, but over time, it adds up. So, why does silence feel so uncomfortable, even when it can be useful? Part of the answer lies in how we interpret it. Silence can feel like exposure. When you stop talking, you stop managing the narrative. You're no longer guiding how others see you in real time. You're leaving space for their interpretation, and that can feel risky, because now you're not in complete control. There's also the fear of being misunderstood. It creeps in quietly. If I don't explain this properly, they might get the wrong idea. If I don't clarify, they might think something I didn't mean. If I don't keep talking, maybe they'll lose interest. So you keep going. You add more context, more explanation, more reassurance. Not because it's always needed, but because it feels safer than leaving things unsaid. Then there's another layer, one that's easy to miss. Silence removes distraction. When there are no words filling the space, attention turns inward. You become more aware of yourself, your thoughts, your emotions, even your insecurities. And that can be uncomfortable, because now there's nothing to hide behind. No quick responses, no ongoing dialogue to keep things moving. Just you and the moment. For some, that moment feels too still, too revealing. So they break it. They speak. This pattern shows up everywhere. In conversations where people interrupt, not out of rudeness, but out of impatience with the pause. In situations where someone answers a question and then keeps talking long after the point has been made. In moments where silence could have created clarity, but instead gets replaced with noise. And here's the part that often goes unnoticed. The discomfort isn't coming from silence itself. It's coming from what silence represents. Uncertainty, lack of control, possibility of judgment. But those things don't disappear when you talk more. They just get covered up, temporarily. In fact, the more you rely on constant talking to avoid that discomfort, the stronger it becomes, because you never give yourself the chance to sit with it, to realize that nothing bad actually happens when you don't fill every gap. There's a quiet kind of confidence that starts to develop when you learn to stay in that space. not forcing words, not rushing to respond, just allowing the moment to exist as it is. It doesn't mean you become silent all the time. It means you become comfortable with the option. And that changes everything. Consider this. Two people are having a conversation. One answers quickly and then keeps adding more, expanding, clarifying, reinforcing every point. The other listens, responds simply, and then stops. Who seems more at ease? Who feels more grounded? Who appears more in control of themselves? It's rarely the one doing more talking. There's something about restraint that signals stability. It suggests that you don't need to chase understanding, that you trust your words to stand on their own, that you're not afraid of what might happen in the silence that follows. And people notice that, even if they can't explain why. This doesn't happen overnight. At first, choosing not to fill the silence can feel almost unnatural. You might catch yourself mid-sentence, realizing you're about to explain something that doesn't need explaining. You might feel the urge to jump in, just to keep the flow going. That urge doesn't disappear immediately. But if you start paying attention to it, really noticing when it shows up, you begin to see a pattern. You begin to recognize that not every thought needs to be spoken. Not every silence needs to be filled. And slowly, something shifts. The discomfort starts to fade. Not completely, but enough. Enough that you can pause without panic. Enough that you can speak without rushing. Enough that you can leave space without feeling the need to control it. There's a kind of freedom in that. A quiet one. Because now you're no longer reacting to silence. You're using it. And that's where things begin to change. Not just in how you communicate, but in how you're perceived. That shift, the one where silence stops feeling like a weakness and starts becoming a tool. That's where real power begins to emerge. And in the next chapter, you'll start to see exactly how that power works.
Chapter 3. The Power Shift, When You Say Less. At first, nothing seems to change. You start speaking a little less. You pause a bit longer. You resist the urge to explain every detail, every thought, every reaction. And on the surface, life goes on as usual. People still talk, conversations still flow, the world is just as loud as before. But underneath that surface, something subtle begins to shift. Not around you, within you. It often starts in small moments. Someone asks you a question. Normally, you'd answer quickly, maybe add a few extra points just to be clear. But this time, you keep it simple, direct. Then you stop. No extra explanation, no follow-up justification. Just silence. For a brief second, it feels almost uncomfortable, like you've left something unfinished. But then, something unexpected happens. The other person leans in, mentally, if not physically. They process what you said more carefully. Sometimes they even ask you to continue. Not because you weren't clear, but because now
They're interested. This is where the power shift begins. Not when you dominate a conversation, not when you out-talk everyone in the room, but when your words become something people seek rather than something you constantly offer. There's a quiet psychology behind this. When something is always available, the mind stops assigning it much value. It blends into the background. But when something is limited, when it appears selectively, intentionally, it gains weight. It draws attention. Your words work the same way. Think about someone you've met who speaks very little, not in a shy or withdrawn way, but in a deliberate, controlled way. They don't rush to respond. They don't interrupt. They don't feel the need to comment on everything. But when they do speak, people listen, almost instinctively. It's not just about what they say. It's about how rarely they say it. Now, here's where many people misunderstand this idea. They assume that speaking less is about holding back, about suppressing thoughts, about becoming quieter in a passive way. But that's not what this is. This is about choice. Not silence out of hesitation, but silence out of control. There's a difference, and people can feel it. When someone is quiet because they're unsure, it comes across as hesitation. When someone is quiet because they're choosing not to speak, it feels like confidence. The behavior might look similar on the surface, but the energy behind it is completely different. And that energy changes how people respond to you. Imagine two people in the same conversation. One speaks frequently, jumping in whenever there's a pause, adding thoughts, expanding on ideas, making sure their presence is felt. The other listens more, speaks occasionally, leaves space after they talk. At first, the first person might seem more active, more engaged, but over time, something shifts. The second person begins to carry more presence, not because they're louder, but because they're measured. Their words start to feel more intentional, more considered, more important, and people begin to treat them that way. They don't interrupt as much. They pay closer attention. They remember what was said. This is the power of contrast. In a noisy environment, restraint stands out. There's also something else happening here, something even more interesting. When you speak less, you create space for others to reveal more. People tend to fill silence. It's almost instinctive. So when you're not constantly talking, others start sharing more than they normally would. More thoughts, more opinions, more details. Sometimes even things they didn't intend to say. And without trying, you gain insight. You start to understand people better, not through direct questioning, but through observation.
This is where influence begins to deepen. Because now, you're not just participating in conversations, you're reading them. You notice tone shifts. You catch small inconsistencies. You pick up on what's said and what's avoided. All of this information was always there, but it was easy to miss when you were focused on speaking. Now you're seeing the full picture, and that gives you an advantage. A quiet one, but a real one. Let's bring this into a real-world moment. Imagine you're in a discussion, maybe at work, maybe with friends. A topic comes up, and people start sharing their opinions. Voices overlap, points are repeated. Everyone is trying, in their own way, to be understood. You could jump in immediately, add your perspective, expand on it, defend it. Or you could wait. You listen,
You let others speak. You watch how the conversation unfolds. And then, when there's a natural pause, you speak. Briefly, clearly, without over-explaining. That moment hits differently, because now your words aren't just another addition to the noise. They're a response to everything that came before. And people feel that. They don't always analyze it consciously, but they notice the difference. There's also a shift in how you experience conversations yourself. When you're not constantly thinking about what to say next, your mind becomes quieter, more focused. You're not rushing, not reacting, just present. And that presence has weight. It changes how you carry yourself, how you listen, even how you make eye contact. All of these small signals add up. They shape how others perceive you. Here's something worth considering. Confidence isn't always loud. In fact, it often isn't. Real confidence can sit comfortably in silence. It doesn't feel the need to prove itself with constant words. When you start speaking less, you begin to tap into that. Not by pretending, not by forcing it, but by removing the unnecessary noise that was covering it. And as that noise fades, something else becomes clearer. Your words. You begin to choose them more carefully, not out of fear, but out of awareness. You start to notice which words add value and which ones don't, which moments call for speaking and which ones are better left alone. This isn't about becoming distant or disengaged. It's about becoming intentional. And that intention is what creates the shift. At some point, you'll notice it. A moment where someone turns to you and asks, "What do you think?" Not out of habit, but because they actually want to know. That's when you realize something has changed. You're no longer chasing attention. You're attracting it. Not by saying more, but by saying less and meaning more. And once that shift begins, it doesn't just affect conversations. It starts to influence how people see you as a whole. Your presence, your decisions, your value. Because when your words carry weight, so do you. In the next chapter, we'll take this further into real situations, real interactions, real moments where knowing when not to speak can change everything, and where silence stops being passive and starts becoming strategic. Chapter 4. Strategic Silence in Real Life. There's a moment in almost every conversation where things could go two different ways. It's subtle, easy to miss. A comment is made. Maybe it's slightly critical. Maybe it's careless. Maybe it hits a nerve you didn't expect. And right there, right in that instant, you feel the urge to respond, to correct it, defend yourself, clarify what you meant, say something, anything, just to regain control of the moment. That urge feels justified, almost necessary. But what you do next changes everything. Most people react. They speak quickly, sometimes emotionally. They try to fix the moment before it has time to settle. And in doing so, they often give away more than they realize. Too much information, too much emotion, too much access. But there's another option, a quieter one. You pause, just for a second. At first, it might feel like you're doing nothing, but in reality, you're doing something very specific. You're choosing not to react immediately. That small gap between what happens and how you respond is where strategic silence begins. Let's take a simple example. Someone says something slightly dismissive to you in a group setting, not openly rude, but enough to feel it. The automatic reaction: you jump in, you explain yourself, you try to reframe what you said so it lands better. But notice what that does. It signals that their comment affected you, that you need to correct their perception, that you're seeking to regain footing. Now imagine a different response. You hear the comment, you look at them, and instead of rushing to reply, you say nothing. Not in an awkward, withdrawn way, but in a calm, composed way. A pause that says, "I heard you, I'm considering it, and I'm not rushed." That silence does something unexpected. It shifts the pressure. Now, instead of you trying to fix the moment, they become aware of it. They might reconsider what they said, adjust their tone, even backtrack slightly. You didn't argue, you didn't defend, you didn't explain, but somehow the dynamic changed. This is the quiet strength of strategic silence. It doesn't force control, it creates it. Let's look at another situation. An argument. Not a dramatic one, just a disagreement that starts to build tension. Voices rise slightly, points are repeated, each side tries to be understood. At some point, most people fall into a pattern. They talk over each other. They repeat the same arguments, just in different words. They try harder and harder to win the conversation. But here's the problem. The more you talk in that state, the less effective your words become. Because now you're not communicating, you're reacting. And reaction rarely leads to clarity. This is where silence becomes powerful, not as avoidance, but as interruption. Imagine you're in the middle of that disagreement. You've made your point, the other person responds, and instead of jumping back in immediately, you stop. You let their words sit. You allow a pause. At first, it might feel like you're losing ground, like you should be saying something to stay engaged. But if you hold that silence for just a moment longer, something shifts. The intensity drops, the rhythm breaks, the conversation resets. And when you speak again, if you choose to, it comes from a different place, more grounded, more controlled. Sometimes that pause alone is enough to de-escalate the situation without saying anything at all. Now let's move into something more subtle, everyday interactions, the kind that don't feel important but quietly shape how people see you. Someone asks you a question, you answer, and then almost automatically you add more. A bit of extra context, a small explanation just to make sure everything is clear. It feels harmless, but over time, it builds a pattern. You become the person who always says a little too much, the one who fills in every gap, the one who doesn't leave space for interpretation.
Now imagine answering differently. You respond clearly, simply. And then you stop. No extra explanation, no unnecessary detail, just enough. That small change does something interesting. It invites the other person to engage, to ask more if they need it, to meet you halfway instead of receiving everything up front. And in that exchange, a subtle balance forms. You're no longer overextending. You're interacting. This becomes even more important in professional settings. Meetings, discussions, decision-making moments. There's often a pressure to prove your value through how much you contribute. So people speak often. They share every thought. They expand on every idea. They want to be seen. But here's what tends to happen. The more someone speaks without restraint,
the less each individual point stands out. Everything blends together. Now, picture someone who approaches it differently. They listen. They observe. They don't rush to speak. And then, at the right moment, they contribute. Briefly. Directly. Without unnecessary buildup. That contribution lands differently, because it's not lost in a stream of constant talking. It arrives with clarity. And over time, that pattern builds reputation, not as someone who talks the most, but as someone whose words matter. There's also a protective side to silence, one that's often overlooked. Not every thought needs to be shared. Not every reaction needs to be visible. Not every opinion needs to be expressed in the moment it appears. When you speak without filtering, when you react instantly, you give people access to everything. Your thoughts, your emotions, your triggers. That level of openness can feel honest, but it can also leave you exposed. Strategic silence creates boundaries. It allows you to choose what you reveal and what you keep to yourself. This isn't about hiding, it's about control. Because once something is said, it can't be taken back. But when it remains unspoken, it stays yours. There's a quiet discipline in that, knowing when to speak, knowing when to hold back. And that discipline changes how people interact with you. They begin to sense that you're not easily pulled into reactions, that you don't say things impulsively, that your words are considered. That creates trust, but also a certain level of respect. Not forced, not demanded, just naturally formed. Of course, there's a balance. Silence isn't about withdrawing from life. It's not about becoming distant or unresponsive. It's about being precise, speaking when it adds value, pausing when it doesn't. And that precision becomes a kind of quiet power, one that doesn't rely on volume or speed or constant presence, but on timing. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. And in the next chapter, you'll see what begins to happen when you fully embrace this, when you stop explaining, stop oversharing, stop trying to control how you're perceived through constant words. Because when that happens, people start to fill in the silence for you, and what they assume can change everything.
Chapter 5. What you gain when you stop explaining. There's a moment, quiet, almost invisible, where you're about to say more than you need to. You've already answered the question. You've already made your point, and yet something inside nudges you. Add a little more, just to be clear, just in case they misunderstood. So you keep going. A few extra sentences, a bit more context, maybe even a small justification you didn't plan to give. It feels responsible, thoughtful even. But here's the part most people don't notice. That extra explanation often costs you more than it gives. At first, it seems harmless. You're just making sure everything is understood. But over time, a pattern forms. You become someone who doesn't just speak, you expand. You don't just answer, you explain. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifts in how people respond to you. They stop leaning in, because there's nothing left to discover. When everything is laid out, every thought, every reason, every detail, there's no space for curiosity, no room for interpretation, no need to engage beyond what's already been said. And without that engagement, your words lose a certain kind of energy. Now imagine the opposite. You say what needs to be said, clear, direct, complete, and then you stop. No extra padding, no over-explaining, no filling the silence that follows. At first, it might feel like you've left something unfinished, like there's more you could say, but that's exactly where the shift begins. Because now the other person has to do something. They have to think, they have to interpret, they have to decide what your words mean without you guiding every step. And that process, it pulls them in. There's a quiet psychological effect at play here. When people are given less information, they don't disengage. They lean closer. They try to fill in the gaps. They become active participants instead of passive listeners. And in doing so, they become more invested in what you said. It's a bit like reading a story that doesn't explain everything, one that leaves certain things unsaid. Those are the stories that stay with you, not because they gave you more, but because they made you think more. Your communication works the same way. When you stop over-explaining, your words gain a certain edge, a kind of quiet sharpness. They don't just pass through people, they stay with them. Let's bring this into a real moment. Someone asks you why you made a certain decision. You could explain everything, your reasoning, your thought process, every detail that led you there. Or you could answer simply, "This felt like the right direction," and stop. That response does something interesting. It closes the door just enough to be complete, but leaves it slightly open. Now the other person has a choice. They can accept it, or they can ask more. Either way, the interaction becomes balanced. You're no longer overextending yourself just to be fully understood. And that balance changes how you're perceived. When you explain everything, it can sometimes feel like you're trying to convince, or justify, or seek approval, even if that's not your intention. But when you say less, when you trust your words to stand as they are, it signals something different. It suggests certainty, not loud, aggressive certainty, just quiet assurance. And people respond to that. There's also something else you gain when you stop explaining, something less obvious, but just as important. You protect your energy. Every time you over-explain, you're giving more than necessary, more time, more effort, more mental space. You're stretching a simple moment into something longer than it needs to be. And if you do that consistently, it adds up. Conversations become draining. Interactions feel heavier, not because of what's being said, but because of how much you're giving away.
Conversations become draining. Interactions feel heavier, not because of what's being said, but because of how much you're giving away. When you start saying less, that changes. You conserve energy. You move through conversations more cleanly, without unnecessary weight. There's a lightness to it. And that lightness allows you to stay more present, more aware, more in control of how you show up. Now, let's talk about something deeper: perception. When you explain yourself too much, you remove ambiguity. You define everything clearly. And while that might seem like a good thing, it also limits how others can see you. Because now there's no mystery, no room for interpretation, no space for people to project their own thoughts, assumptions, or curiosity onto you. But when you hold back, just slightly, you create that space. And people naturally try to fill it. They start to wonder, to think about what you meant, to interpret your words in their own way. And often, They assign more depth than you explicitly gave, not because you said more, but because you allowed more. This is where a quiet kind of influence begins to form, not through force, not through persuasion, but through absence. What you don't say becomes just as important as what you do. Of course, this doesn't mean you become vague or unclear. That's not the goal. Clarity still matters. But there's a difference between being clear and being exhaustive. You don't need to explain every layer for your message to land. In fact, sometimes it lands better when you don't. There's also a boundary that starts to take shape, a healthy one. When you stop explaining everything, you stop feeling the need to justify yourself constantly. You stop seeking agreement in every interaction. You become comfortable with the idea that not everyone needs to fully understand you. And that comfort, it's powerful. Because now, your sense of clarity doesn't depend on someone else's reaction. It comes from within. You say what you mean, you leave it there, and you move on. That shift might seem small, but it changes how you carry yourself. You're no longer chasing validation through words. You're expressing yourself and letting it stand. And people feel that difference, even if they can't quite explain why. There's a certain presence that comes with it, one that doesn't need to over-communicate to be understood. And over time, that presence builds something else. Respect. Not the kind that's asked for or demanded, but the kind that forms naturally. Because when someone doesn't feel the need to explain everything, it suggests they trust themselves. And that trust is something others tend to recognize. So the next time you feel that urge to add more, to clarify again, to make absolutely sure everything is understood, pause just for a moment. Ask yourself, is this necessary, or am I just trying to make it safer? You might still choose to speak. Sometimes more explanation is needed, but often it isn't. And in those moments, saying less doesn't take away from your message. It strengthens it. Because what you leave unsaid can carry just as much weight as what you choose to speak. In the final chapter, we'll bring all of this together, not as a technique, but as a transformation. Because this isn't just about speaking less. It's about becoming someone whose words truly matter. Chapter 6. Becoming someone whose words matter. At some point, without a clear announcement, something changes. It doesn't happen all at once. There's no dramatic moment where everything suddenly clicks. Instead, it builds quietly, conversation by conversation, pause by pause, word by word. And then one day, you notice it. People listen differently. Not in an obvious way. No one points it out. No one says, "You've changed," but you feel it. In the way someone waits for you to finish without interrupting. In the way your opinion is asked for, not out of habit, but with intention. In the way your words seem to stay in the room a little longer after you've said them. This is the shift. Not just in how you speak, but in who you've become while learning to speak less. Because at its core, this was never just about silence. It was about intention. Earlier, you might have spoken to fill space, to avoid awkwardness, to make sure you were understood, to stay visible in conversations that never seemed to pause. Now, that urgency has faded. You no longer feel the need to respond immediately. You don't rush to explain every detail. You don't chase every opportunity to speak. And because of that, when you do speak, it matters. There's a kind of discipline behind this. Not forced, not rigid, just steady. You've learned to sit in silence without needing to break it. You've learned to observe without immediately reacting. You've learned to let moments pass without feeling the need to control them. That changes your presence. You're no longer carried by the flow of every conversation. You move within it deliberately. And people feel that difference, even if they don't consciously understand it. There's something else happening too, something deeper. When you stop overspeaking, you start thinking differently. Your thoughts slow down, not in a dull way, but in a more precise way. You begin to filter naturally, not by force, but by awareness. Before, a thought would appear, and almost instantly, it would become words. Now, there's a space in between, a brief moment where you consider it, shape it, decide whether it needs to be said at all. That space is where clarity forms, and over time, that clarity sharpens everything you say. Your words become fewer, but heavier. You don't repeat yourself as often. You don't drift into unnecessary details. You speak when there's something worth adding. And when there isn't, you're comfortable letting silence do its work. That comfort is what sets you apart. Because most people still feel the pull, the urge to fill every gap, to respond quickly, to stay constantly engaged. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's human. But you've stepped slightly outside of it. Not completely, just enough. Enough to see the pattern, enough to choose differently. And that choice shows up in subtle ways.
In a conversation, you might pause before answering, not because you're unsure, but because you're considering. In a disagreement, you might listen fully before responding, without rushing to defend your position. In a group setting, you might speak once, clearly, instead of multiple times with less impact. Each of these moments seems small, but together they reshape how you're perceived. You're no longer just another voice in the room, you're a presence within it. There's also a shift in how you handle being misunderstood. Before, that might have triggered an immediate response, a need to clarify, to correct, to make sure everything was aligned. Now, there's more patience. You understand that not every misunderstanding needs to be fixed instantly, that sometimes clarity comes with time, or doesn't come at all, and that's okay. This doesn't mean you avoid important conversations. It means you approach them with more control. You choose when to speak, and just as importantly, when not to. That balance is what gives your words weight. Because when you're not speaking all the time, your voice becomes noticeable. Not louder, just more defined. There's a presence behind it, a sense that what you're saying has been considered, chosen. And that makes people pay attention, not because you demand it, but because you've created it. At this point, something else becomes clear. You don't need to prove yourself through constant expression. You don't need to fill space to maintain relevance. You don't need to explain every part of who you are to be understood. You can exist, speak, and be heard without overextending. That realization brings a kind of calm, a quiet confidence, not the kind that seeks attention, but the kind that holds itself steadily without needing validation. And from that place, your words begin to carry something more than just meaning. They carry presence. Because now, when you speak, it's not just about the words themselves, it's about the restraint behind them, the awareness that shaped them, the silence that surrounds them. All of that is felt, even if it's not consciously noticed. This is what it means to become someone whose words matter. Not someone who speaks the most, not someone who dominates every conversation,
but someone who understands the value of timing, of restraint, of intention. Someone who knows that silence isn't empty, it's space. Space that gives your words room to land, room to breathe, room to be remembered. And once you understand that, you don't need to force anything. You don't need to chase attention. You don't need to compete with noise. Because in a world where everyone is trying to be heard, you've learned something different. You've learned how to be felt. And that's a different kind of power entirely. Not loud, not obvious, but lasting. So the next time you find yourself in a conversation with words ready to spill out, pause. Not to hold back, not to disappear, but to choose. Because the less you say, the more it means. And when it means more, people listen.